based in India, and working more as an non-profit work, and then eventually moved into commercial storytelling, coming to a film school, and that's how I finally landed up making films. So that's sort of like a gist of what I'm.
So what's interesting about you is that so you grew up somewhere very different culturally, maybe from where you went to school, USC, right? So, but you went back for filmmaking there. Do you see any differences in sort of starting off your projects, like as being a filmmaker from what we would consider the West, and then bringing these stories up?
Absolutely. As we discussed, for us growing up, filmmaking and films was like an out of this world dream. And even though we have been very active here in school as a theater actor, a theater director, and all that, filmmaking was never our goal, And then suddenly you find this interest and you find this opportunity. Um, you say, okay, what are the stories I will tell, right? And then these stories are there people telling these stories? No, right? And then I want to tell those stories, and then I say, okay, let me find out how best it is, and then you'll end up writing your own story, and you'll end up telling, creating your story, and then you'll end up trying to find the audience for your own story. And as I was saying before, we grew up in a time when all this technology was not available. We were just scrambling resources here and there, finding people, finding help, and then making something, and then physically sending them to for people to view. Now everything is digital online. So those are the developments and challenges we went through. But now we have to adjust to whatever the time brings in, I guess.
Yeah. So being from Tibet, it's something that maybe a lot of people want to know more about, and maybe they haven't heard about. Can you explain sort of the region, maybe why you want to tell stories from this this particular culture?
Well, see, Tibet is a country that is in between China and India. So, and we landed up in India as refugees, after the Chinese revolution, sort of say. And as we, grew up in Tibetan communities in India, our environment was very small and yet very diverse in terms of, as a community we are Tibetans, but the world around us is Indians, and then India is itself a very diverse nation, and it has all kinds of culture and traditions. So we grew up learning all that, adapting all that, and then contributing towards it. And that's how I, build up my own self as a storyteller. So I now tell stories about India, Tibet, Nepal, and now we are developing projects for China. So all that upbringing, background, and exposure shapes you in the person you are in terms of telling that story, those stories you want to tell.
What are some of the themes? I know you mentioned like you lost count of how many films you've done now, but do you see a common theme of like that you know have started since those first films?
I say, the most common thing is, these are my stories, or stories about my people or my culture, my traditions, and my history. So that's the common thread. But then recently, I sort of started expanding into the other cultures of Nepal. Like, for example, the last film was an action film about an American kid going back to Nepal, trying to reconnect with his root, and you know, Nepal is culturally closer to Tibet, but at the same time, it's not me. But I know about it. I grew. Part of my life was there too. So that is also how you sort of blend your work in terms of how you want to tell the stories. That's the basic foundation, I guess.
Your work is also a blend of this in terms of language, right?
Mhm.
Because it is in multiple languages.
Yes, yeah. Like usually it'll be Tibetan, but then depending on the story, then it can be Nepalese, English. The last film was Nepalese English. Then some stories are Indian. Some stories are all English, but of characters who are non-American. They're Indians or Nepalese or something. So it's multi-language, but a particular story requires particular, let's say, a language to tell that, right? So it just depends on what story you're telling and what language you want to tell that story into. But the audience remains same, so the audience is like, why I became a filmmaker, right? I want to tell my stories. And my stories is something that nobody else is telling, so I say, hey, Americans don't know anything about Tibetan weddings. Let me create a story around Tibetan weddings. Or Tibetan, they don't know about Tibetan New Year. Well, let me tell them a story around the New Year. So those are the basics.
Was something that struck me when you were talking to me about your work is that most of your audience comes from Western audiences. Was that a surprise to you, getting to know that these people that are maybe culturally different were really interested in your work?
Sort of, yes, and also it was intentional from my part, because I want to tell my stories to the world, not just my community, because my community knows my stories, right? Or India knows, they create the largest number of films in the world, so me as a small addition will hardly make any difference. But the kind of stories I want to tell will make that difference, right? So I said, okay, what is the different kind of story I want to tell? And then, is this the right audience? Then the goal of that particular story matters, right? So a lot of Americans don't know about Tibet, don't know about even India, and then you go deeper, then India is so diverse. So it's, depending on those elements of the story, then you find the audience. And then because I studied in the West as a filmmaker, then I know the tools of this world, and then I know the stories of that world. I try to blend it and make it palatable to this audience, and then this audience is happy, okay, oh, this is very different visual, but the struggle of the characters are similar, it's about a father who's trying to connect with his daughter, sort of thing, right?
So you've been making films for over 30 years, you maybe even 40, you said, right? What are some of the challenges you have, especially filming on location?
Well, I think the challenges were different over the years, right? So, when as a filmmaker, when I started off, it was not to make films. It was more like an activism, How can I tell stories to this community about something? So it was very documentarian sort of a storytelling. And that too very crude, like all we did was, okay, go there and interview somebody, right? And then that's the film, and then go and, see what they're doing, and that's the film, right? But then eventually then you realize like, oh no, this is not the way, there's a proper way to tell that story. And those early experiences uh, gave us a lot of challenges of resources, learning. The curve was very high, and then the technology was not as you have now, right? So it's like physically, even editing was like putting a tape here and creating a master here. Now everything is at the same time,
Yeah.
right? So those challenges were different. Now the challenges is like there's so many, there's so much of content that I don't know, what do I want to watch? Even you sit down to watch Netflix show and you half an hour you just spend trying to find what you want to watch,
Yeah.
right? And then you go to what YouTube or Instagram or wherever. There's millions of things you can watch, but then what, how we, as content creators, how do we find our audience? That is the challenge now, right? And it's different, it's unique, and it's hard, and at the same time it's easy, you know.
Yeah, I asked you earlier if you think filmmaking is more difficult, but I believe you said that it's easier, but the distribution might be getting the film seen is different.
Yeah, I think finding the audience now is much more challenging than earlier times. Earlier times you all you had was television or the theater. Right now, there's like 100 different apps you can just keep scrolling and watch things. So, and then earlier it was difficult to create because the technology, the resources were demanding. Now you can make a film with your iPhone or just a simple camera, and audience is very uh, forgiving. If they like something, they will just make it viral, and you have the audience, right? So it depends on the circumstances of what you're creating, I guess.
Do you tend to work with a lot of the same people?
Yes and no, both. Yes, because if I have the option, I do like working with the same people because it makes it more efficient and easier. And yeah, but then the circumstances is like where the project is and what my resources are, and whether I can bring the same team or I have to hire a new team. It just depends. But generally, I prefer the same because it makes it easier in terms of not continuously trying to manage. They are independent people. They know what they want to do. They know how I think. I know how they think, and then it makes it smooth, sort of. So.
So when you direct film, you tend to be writing most of your work, right? So how long does a project usually take for you from when you start writing it to maybe get, you start, getting it into production? Have you had some that go on for years?
You don't want to know that. I'm working on a series on the Dalai Lama. It took me almost 20 years now, and I'm just starting production on it. So projects can take that long, or I worked on this Nepalese Hollywood production. In hardly 6 months, we had an idea, we had a script, and in 1 year we filmed it and we finished it. And then COVID happened, and the film came out after 2 years. So again, the gestation period was same. So, different projects depend on different timeline, I guess. But as a writer director, we choose what we want to make, and when you do that, then the timeline really doesn't matter. We just want to tell the story, and then we keep working on it in terms of bringing resources, in terms of attaching elements, and then finally making it on the theaters or on screen, I guess, right? But if you, as a filmmaker, as a director or writer, if it is your career in a studio or a production, then the timelines are much shorter. Like I used to make a lot of music videos and ads, So they were instant, So like, okay, some musician, singer comes like, I have this much money, can you do something? Okay, let's go, we'll make it. Or it's an ad, a couple of weeks and you're done, you're making your money. But for films and CDs and all, it takes time according to your passion for that project, I guess.
So with this more current project that you talked about, what do you think makes this one, makes the timeline a bit longer than some of the previous?
One, because it is an expensive project, because we are telling a very spiritual story of the Dalai Lama for 600 to 700 years of history. So we are, and because it is a historical / spiritual story, accuracy is very important, right? And then because it requires so much money and it is not very commercial, people are, trying to find a way to make it. Now we're eventually going to make it for HBO, so, that it becomes easier for us to work around it, right? Now, literally, we are in the process right now and doing that for them, right? Or somebody, depending on when. So the requirement of the project, perhaps, and then, 20 years ago, I was not the man I am now, with a lot more experience and a lot more connections and a lot more help. 20 years ago, people just didn't care about me so much. Now they listen to me and then they say, oh, what else are you doing? I said, I'm doing this project, great. What do you have? I have this and this. I said, great, let's do it.
Do you feel an added pressure now that you've been doing it longer, whether to yourself or to your community?
Pressure in the sense it's a very important story, and it is got a lot of geopolitics, it's got a lot of spirituality, it's got a lot of millions of followers who want to know about it. So those are pressure, right? And then I have to make it correct by the book, correct by people, correct by investor. So those are pressures that I have to face, but it's part of the filmmaking, I guess.
Yeah. Also, I think filmmaking is, because it combines visual and, sound and everything, it's a great means to show sort of where you're from, showing it directly on location. Is there anything you would want to share with, because I know you were also a professor at USC, with any film students about sort of getting to tell their stories, and maybe it's not being as easy as doing something a bit more commercial?
Advice, suggestion, each film, each story is different, each person's journey is different. But generally, I would say now, if 20 years back, if I had all this technology with me, I would preferably just go out there and make my film, right? And not care about who's going to give me money and to make this film. I would say, if there is somebody doing it, great. If there's nobody, so let's go and do it. It's so easier now. So I would say, follow your passion, and then you will find a path to telling that story. Right now, for example, I'm developing a period martial art film between India and China, right? And it requires a lot of resources. But my goal is these two massive countries, the most populous countries, the superpowers, they have never interacted, right? How can I build that? And then as a filmmaker, I said, okay, culturally, I can maybe tell a story about the fundamental way people know China and India. So art, right? And then let me build what is the basic art of these two countries are. martial art is very popular. Let me tell a story about Indian martial art and Chinese martial art, right?
Yeah.
Now, is there somebody who wants to make it? I will say, great. If not, I'll find resources and means to make it, right? And that's how I have to follow each of the projects. And I believe all these other younger filmmakers, they too have to do the similar route. But if you're a cinematographer, if you're a sound editor or a picture editor or composer, then your journey is different. But as a filmmaker, as a director, or a writer, then your journey is similar to mine. It hasn't changed. It will never change. You have to just tell your story. How you want to tell it is, either on a phone or on an IMAX camera. Depends on your skill as a
So is there anything, lastly, that you feel like makes something fundamentally Tibetan? Is it like so diverse that it's found throughout your works, or is there something that you really think it's part of the culture?
I think the fundamental, ground of my being is part of my story. Okay, as a Tibetan, I know my culture, my traditions far better than anybody else, right? So I will tell those stories myself, and then how does my stories make different, right? And it can be the visual, it can be the language, it can be the music, right? But the journey of the character is same, right?
Yeah.
It's whether American or Indian or Tibetan, the journey of each character is similar, There are ups and downs and there's an arc.
That's amazing. Well, we loved having you here. Thank you so much for being here and talking about your projects. Lastly, I just want to ask, do you have a production company name or anywhere we can find your works currently?
I think people just Google me and they'll find me, but my company is Clear Mirror Pictures, and we have a website where we update our, but then each film has its different websites.
Different, and HBO coming up too, right? So
never know.
look up that one. Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much, and I want to thank everyone at Maya TV for watching, and stick around for the next one. Thank you.